Hi, my name is Liz Nemec, and I'm here to make a case for more holistic approaches in researching what are commonly called invasive species. As scientists, it is our ethical duty to generate knowledge that helps us better understand natural phenomena in order to more closely align our own perspectives with that of our lived reality. And this has direct applications socially, politically, and economically as we make individual and collective decisions based on our accumulated knowledge. And one area of study that has undergone dramatic image changes and rebrands over the past century is that of introduced or non-native species. Now, for the better part of the 19th century, introduced species were met with relative indifference. And this all changed in 1958 when Charles Elton published a book called Ecology of Invasions, giving introduced species a whole new image. As a result of increased concern for invasive species, a new field of study called invasion ecology was born. And this new field was characterized by the seemingly unspoken assumption that all non-native species were detrimental to ecosystems, holding the potential to become our worst fears, invasive. And what got me interested in the history of introduced species was a project where I attempted a content analysis of scientific literature ranging from 1910 to 2019, assessing the incidence of words that I deemed either neutral or negative concerning introduced species. So words like alien, invasive, and exotic seem to convey more than just scientific knowledge, so I wanted to see if the use of these words had changed over time. And what I found is that the proportion of negative words did increase from 1910 to 1959, peaking between 1960 and 1969, as you can see here. And a reminder that Charles Elton's book was published in 1958. So thanks to high-profile invasive plant species such as kudzu, purple loosestrife, and multiflora rose, the concept of invasive species has certainly invaded our vocabulary. And it goes without being said that examples such as these make us concerned for biodiversity and the security of beloved plants in the landscape. Situations like this also make us struggle as ecologists to view introduced species in a way that is balanced. In reading various papers about these so-called invasive species, I began to wonder whether these plants truly had exclusively negative effects, or if those were the only ones we were looking for. And actually, when we look very closely at the literature, we do see record of some known invasive species exhibiting positive effects on their environments. And I am not alone in asking this question. We are seeing more and more criticism of the term invasive. In recent years, more ecologists have challenged these assumptions surrounding the term invasive and called for stronger, more ecologically based criteria. In this study, I am interested in one such high-profile non-native, Microstegium vaminium, a species that has been called invasive by many concerned ecologists and frustrated gardeners alike. Microstegium vaminium, or Japanese silkgrass, is a warm season grass introduced to the northeastern United States from Southeast Asia, and it is believed to have been unintentionally introduced through its use as packing material on ships in the early 1900s. While Microstegium vaminium, or as we call it silkgrass, is formally recognized as invasive by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Forest Service, it can actually have a range of effects. Since silkgrass is abundant across many forests in this area, my study attempted to represent the whole range of possible effects silkgrass can have in 6 suburban forests of central Jersey. As the pre-existing sites of Dr. Janet Morrison's long-term study on the interactive effects of 2 non-native species additions and white-tailed deer, there are 40 plots across 6 forests, half of which contain stiltgrass treatments. Guided by curiosities about how implicit biases influence the generation of scientific knowledge, my study addressed how we can measure multiple effects that silkgrass may or may not be having in order to have a more comprehensive view of how these plants behave in our study sites. So we asked the question, is silkgrass acting as a classic invader in our study sites? To answer this, I investigated 5 measures of plant community health and composition to create a comprehensive model of the behavior of silkgrass in the study sites. And this included the native plant community, deer pressure, the abundance of silkgrass, as well as soil microbial activity and earthworm activity. And we also added forest age as a factor later on and incorporated initial measures of species richness and abundance, but we'll get into that in a second. So while those are the general concepts that we were looking to measure, more specifically, the data we used for native plants was the change in percent cover as well as the change in species richness. For deer pressure, we used these specially created browse and shrub indices that are a proxy for deer pressure. For the abundance of silkgrass, we very simply used percent cover. And now for soil microbial activity, we have phospholipid-derived fatty acid data that we get from a professional soil lab. And specifically what I pulled from that was the ratio of fungi to bacteria, since fungi are indicators of healthy, nutrient-rich soil. And then I also used two ratios that measure the fat in bacteria. And if these ratios are high, this indicates that the bacteria are well adjusted to the soil. And now for earthworm activity, we score the presence of earthworm castings as well as leaf litter as two non-invasive measures, which also proxy earthworm presence. So when it came to analyzing this data, we knew that we needed a manner of multivariate analysis since we were looking to analyze how these 5 concepts interacted. So we landed on structural equation modeling, and SEM is uniquely equipped to discover direct and indirect relationships between your variables, which made it really perfect for our goal of obtaining this comprehensive look at stiltgrass. And it also is unique in that it allows a meta-model to serve as a system-wide hypothesis. So what we did was we pooled data across 6 study sites, and we broke this down into 2 models, one that analyzed the herbaceous plant community and another that analyzed the woody plant community. And as I said, SEM allows for a system-wide hypothesis. So this is a picture of what that looked like. This is our meta model where we hypothesized that deer pressure, earthworm activity, and competition from siltgrass would each have a negative effect on the native plant community health. And based on conflicting evidence from the literature, I did not predict whether soil microbial activity would positively or negatively affect the natives. I only hypothesized that it would have some effect. And this was my overall hypothesis for both the woody and native plant communities, although they were tested separately. So after transforming and removing 3 outliers for a total sample size of 222 plots, a measurement model was constructed based on our hypothesis, and the model was tested and iteratively modified, removing non-significant paths and incorporating additional paths as recommended by the literature and the modeling, and this was done for both the woody and herbaceous models. And this process is how we ended up adding these 2 new concepts: forest age and initial native percent cover and species richness. And after testing many versions, we arrived at the final fitted version of each model. So what we found, an unexpected finding, was that 2 of the measures that we added in later, the initial plant cover and initial species richness measurements, were actually the largest drivers in both the woody and herbaceous models. And this tells us that the areas that started out with higher vegetation were actually more likely to see a decrease in vegetation over time. This does not tell us much about why this decrease is happening, just that it is happening. But this finding is striking and would be a good source of future research. And deer pressure, although singularly represented by the Browse index as opposed to the originally intended large latent variable, still supported the hypothesis of both models and decreased the change in plant cover and species richness, which aligns with what we've seen in the literature. And based on the process of extracting earthworms that we have previously done in these forests, we know that there are a significant number of the introduced species Amynthus in our study sites. And the literature would lead us to believe that this abundance of non-native earthworm activity would inhibit native plants, but we saw little direct evidence of any relationship between the 2. Additionally, the soil microbial community did not play a major role in the native plant community as predicted, although there seemed to be a slight positive association between the soil community and siltgrass cover in both models, potentially suggesting some kind of mutually beneficial situation between siltgrass and the soil. This seems to suggest the opposite of what was previously understood as a negative interaction between the 2, based on competition over resources like nitrogen. A closer examination would be needed to explore how this relationship might be mutually advantageous, as indicated here. As for the soil community's effect on vegetation, the small, non-recursive negative relationship between the soil and initial woody species richness points to the possibility of the soil slightly inhibiting native woody vegetation. Since this interaction seems to be small, future analyses could rule this out as specious or potentially clarify the non-recursive relationship between the soil and vegetation. And reconsidering the plant that started this whole project, siltgrass, it is worth noting that siltgrass did not have the dominating role on woody or herbaceous native plants that one might expect upon learning that siltgrass is classified as an invasive species. Even more surprising is that siltgrass had a slight positive effect on the woody natives. And this could be due to the fact that siltgrass takes up the herbaceous niche but does not compete as avidly with woody natives, thus allowing siltgrass to more happily coexist with woody species. It is also possible that siltgrass provides protection for small woody seedlings that would otherwise be eaten by herbivores, thus sheltering the seedlings until they establish. Still, this calls us to reconsider our immediate assumption that siltgrass is acting as a classic invader in this particular environment. And this is a picture of our final herbaceous model. One major difference between the woody and herbaceous models was that the herbaceous model ended up being much more simple, with two of the original latent variables being sort of demoted to single measurements. And the woody model, pictured here, actually retained all latent variables and ended up including additional paths. So you can see how it's much more complicated and there's a lot more going on than there was in the herbaceous model. And this alone highlights a dramatic difference between the role of herbaceous and woody natives in these ecosystems, where it seems like woody species are much more interrelated with these factors, which could be due to most woody species being perennial and how they have more time to be affected by the factors across multiple seasons. So looking back at our hypothesized model and comparing this to what our results were, we see that deer pressure did behave as expected. The earthworms and the soil microbes didn't have as much of an effect on the natives. Stiltgrass, surprisingly, did not have a dramatic effect on the natives and may have even had a positive effect. And siltgrass actually had more of a relationship with the soil community than anything else. And lastly, initial cover and species richness were the strongest drivers here. And overall, these findings add to the evidence of introduced species behaving neutrally or even advantageously, and we would be hard-pressed to call siltgrass a classic invader in these sites. So bit by bit, we are finding more and more research that challenges our previous assumptions about introduced species. And luckily, there are some great theories being developed to reflect this open-minded thinking. So one example is how we are shifting from focusing on the weapons of introduced species or the characteristics of the introduced species themselves that would make them invasive. And instead, we are focusing more on the resilience and susceptibility, so the characteristics of the environment, and taking it case by case. Additionally, the empty niche hypothesis suggests that introduced species like stiltgrass are potentially taking advantage of niches that would otherwise be empty. And lastly, it cannot go without being said, the synergistic effect between deer and introduced species, where we see these high populations of deer and how they can potentially create empty niches for these introduced species to fill. So this study is in good company among this larger discussion about reevaluating the way we research and describe introduced species. And there's no denying that introduced species can and have dramatically shaped certain ecosystems for the worse. But beyond aesthetic concerns, our goal as scientists is to ask the question of how introduced species are interacting in their new environments, instead of the leading question, which asks how are introduced species invading their new environments. And so this study attempted a comprehensive evaluation of stiltgrass in our study sites, from which we gained illuminating insights. Still, comprehensive methodology is always a challenge, and there's always room for improvement as well as future analyses. This study can serve as a reminder for us to be careful and critical when using the word invasive. Based on our research here, as well as what we know about the power of words, it seems in our best interest to take more care when studying and describing the complicated and fascinating ecological effects of introduced species. So here are some of my citations. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time, and a huge thank you to my research mentor, Dr. Janet Morrison, for her invaluable help and guidance throughout this process, as well as her constant wisdom throughout the years. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations.